What's going on? So it has been an exciting week for Apple updates. And I mean, Apple has dropped some bombshells this week. And, we all knew this was coming. We were all waiting for this day, especially those of us that have been following the M1 processor, the Apple Silicon. Be sure to stick around at the end of this video because I have figured something out with the price points that I want to share with you. And also, don't forget to subscribe. I had made this prediction this time last year, whenever they finally update the 16-inch MacBook Pro, we're going to see 32 gigs, 64 gigs of memory on the M1 chip, if they call it that. And this thing is going to be lightning fast. And that's exactly what's happened. We now have 32 gigabyte and 64 gigabyte MacBook Pros that come in both 14 and 16-inch configurations. Okay, so first off, we need to go over just a little bit of history. All right, so last year around this time, Apple released the M1 MacBook Pro, and they released it, as far as laptops go, they only released it on the 13-inch MacBook. And I was just really blown away by this thing. Like, it has just been amazing. I mean, compared to the Intel MacBook that I had, it was a 15-inch Intel MacBook. I was always having to encode my 4K video to proxy, which means basically downscaling it to 1080p, just so I could edit it. And then whenever I would go to render at the end, I would go back up to 4K. This thing even has the ability to edit some 8K footage. But yeah, for 4K, which is really all that anyone ever really needs, this thing it's just been phenomenal. I've edited on battery. I've edited in the car. It doesn't get very hot. This was last year. This is where Apple started with their new M1 architecture. So considering how this machine has lower specs than the current MacBooks that they're releasing, I think we're in for a big surprise when these come out next week. On Tuesday, Apple is going to be releasing 2 new processors to enhance their MacBook Pro lineup. And these will be for the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBooks. The processors are actually called the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. Now, both of these processors actually have 10 CPU cores, 8 of which are high-performance cores, and 2 of which are high-efficiency cores. So those are the ones that are going to be in use whenever you're on battery and you're just surfing the web. The high-performance cores come into effect whenever you're really pushing the machine or taxing it where it needs to do a lot more processing. So this is interesting because on the M1 13-inch MacBook, it actually had 4 high-performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. So why is everyone making such a big deal out of these new processors? And it really has to do with just one thing. They have unified memory. It's a system on a chip, just like in our phones. You can't upgrade the memory later. If you think of it in terms of like what we've called RAM in the past, this memory is available to the CPU, the GPU, any other component on the system on a chip, and it's super fast access. It doesn't have to go out through a slow data bus. The CPU and GPU aren't separated like they were in previous Pro laptops. So this is just all around more efficient. The previous M1 had about a 66 gigabyte per second memory bandwidth. They have now increased that to 200 gigabytes per second for the M1 Pro and 400 gigabytes per second for the M1 Max. Okay, so let's talk about the next thing, which I think is equally as important as the new processors, and this is the displays. Apple has updated the new MacBooks with thinner bezels. In fact, they actually decided to create a notch, which, it looks like an iPhone. They put this notch up at the top to basically hold the camera, and then the menu is essentially flush with the notch as well. The notch seems like it's bigger than it would have needed to be. Maybe it's for aesthetic purposes. The display on the larger MacBook actually ends up at 16.2 inches diagonally. This gives us a display with 7.7 million pixels. It's not quite 4K. The resolution is 3456 by 2234. And on the 14-inch MacBook, 14.2-inch diagonal with 5.9 million pixels at a resolution of 3024 by 1964, so basically a 3K display. Followed what they had done with the new iPhone 13 Pros and added a variable refresh rate that goes all the way up to 120 hertz. So this is going to be great for developing apps which need that 120 hertz. They actually gave the ability to set the refresh rate as well. So if you're doing any type of video editing at 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, you'll be able to calibrate your display to actually match the video output. And then finally, they told us that it was actually a liquid retina XDR display. Now, what they said about this was that it actually was designed from their more expensive XDR display that you can purchase, but it was based on the pixels from the iPad Pro. Now, keep in mind that the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 processor actually uses something they call True Tone technology. This XDR display is going to give you more colors. You're going to be able to see more of that P3 color gamut curve that we're working towards as we begin to adopt HDR. You're going to be able to watch HDR videos on it, as well as color grade for HDR. It has a sustained brightness of 1000 nits with a peak brightness of 1600 nits and a contrast ratio of 1,000,000 to 1. And you're going to be able to take it out, hopefully in the sun, and be able to actually see your screen just like on your iPhone. So I did want to show you just a few configuration options for the new MacBook Pros because I found them to be kind of interesting. So this is the base model of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and you'll see that the price starts here at around $2,000. Basically what it comes with is an 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU with 16 gigabytes of unified memory. So again, this is the base model. So for $200 more, you can add 2 additional CPU cores, and that brings the price to $2,200. Then for another $100, you can add 2 additional GPU cores, which will bring the price to $2,300. But then this is where it actually gets somewhat interesting. If you upgrade to the M1 Max, you end up getting an additional 8 GPU cores, and this will take you from that 200 gigabytes per second up to the 400 gigabytes per second memory speed. And you automatically at this point get 32 gigabytes of unified memory. So this particular jump from the M1 Pro with the 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU to the M1 Max base, you get a lot for that. And I know the price does seem kind of expensive. It's $2,900, but I feel like this price point right here, as far as like if you want a more robust, more powerful laptop, this is where I would go. Now, the same thing actually happens over on the 16-inch side. Okay, so here we are customizing a 16-inch MacBook Pro, and this is the base model. And it essentially starts at $2,500. You get 10 CPU cores with 16 GPU cores, 16 gigabytes of unified memory. And the menu options on this side work just a little differently. You can't really upgrade the CPU and GPU cores for the M1 Pro chip. You basically can just add 32 gigs of unified memory. That comes to $400, bringing the total to $2,900. And then, well, what's interesting is you can, for just $200 more, you can upgrade to the M1 Max processor. And this, just like over on the 14-inch side, gives you an additional 8 GPU cores. It's going to give you a speed bump in your memory. And this is going to bring the total to around $3,100. Of course, I didn't get into the amount of solid state. You can for both of these. Well, you could upgrade to 64 gigs of unified memory if you have another $400 to throw down. And of course, it gets really pricey as you upgrade that solid state storage, all the way maxed out. This thing is I believe 58. Let me see. We can even go to 32 cores on a GPU. Maxed out, you're looking at $6,100. That's for the most expensive MacBook Pro. Gosh, I wish I could afford that. Also, don't forget you may be eligible for Apple's education pricing, so be sure to check that out because it can save a good bit on especially these more expensive MacBook Pros. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this particular video. I've really enjoyed making this video and sharing with you the knowledge that I have learned about the new MacBook Pros. I would really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up, and also please subscribe to the channel. I've been doing more Apple content. I'm also got some content in about different camera gear, and I would love to have you along for the ride. Also, let me know down in the comments what particular MacBook you're either looking at or have purchased and when it will be arriving. I'd really like to hear from you. Well, that's going to be it for this one. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.